So thank you for another episode of Real People, Real Stories. In front of us, we have a new guest who I'll let them introduce themselves, tell us who they are, their name, and what they do, and then we'll pick it from there.
Well, I'm Honorable Titus Mbathi, honorable because I am a former member of Parliament. In fact, a former minister in the Mbowe administration and a former permanent secretary in the Kenyatta administration. Independence is one of my earliest memories because it was dramatic. It was a change from being colonized by the Britishers to being self-governing. I personally witnessed the lowering of the British flag and the raising of the Kenya flag for the first time at Uhuru Gardens. And I can tell you it was a momentous moment that we shall never ever forget. It was so very important, changing the country from a colony, or transforming the country from a colony to an independent country, under the leadership of the first president, the late Mzee Jomo Kenyatta.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe as we go a little bit backwards before independence, what was your earliest memory as a child growing up? Which area did you grow up and how was that?
I grew up in rural Kenya, a village known as Mulango in the Kitui County. I hope you know where the Kitui County is in the eastern part of our country. And I grew up in a village, in a middle-class family. My father was the chief district commissioner's clerk, which was one of the highest appointments at the time. He himself had a dramatic experience. He was the first member of our family to become a Christian. And this in itself was by accident. You know, in Ukambani we get occasional famines because we are in the drylands, you know. And when there was famine in Ukambani, people used to go to the coast to go and sell ivory, leopard and lion skins, etc., and bring back calico and so on to sell in order to get foodstuffs. So my father, as a young teenager, went with other people from his village to the coast. They went on foot, needless to say, a distance of about 300 kilometers. No, miles.
On foot, all the way from Kitui?
On foot. And there were no roads, of course. They used to use paths. So, to cut a long story short, by the time they got to the coast, he got to Rabai. Do you know Rabai? Before getting to Mombasa, there was a Lutheran mission. So, at the mission, when they got there, they were starved. Having spent about a fortnight traveling, they ate everything that they had, all the animals they could shoot on the way, until eventually they had to chew the skins on which they were sleeping. This is a story told by my father. It's true. You know, if you cut a skin, you can roast it, and you chew it at least to feel that you are eating something, you know. It was at that stage that they got to the mission. The missionary, they found other boys of their age, properly dressed, at the mission. So the missionaries invited them to join them, and they did. So that is where my father learned about Christianity. That is where he also became literate, taught by the missionaries. They were Lutherans from Ludwig, Leipzig in Germany. So my father never went to a formal school. And he rose to become a district clerk He was a very hard-working and intelligent person. So that was our origin. My father was the first member of our family to become a Christian, shunned by his family, but he was a strong-willed man. He remained a Christian, cast away by his family, but he never wavered. And he remained a Christian until the age of 80-something. And that is our foundation as Christians to date.
Wow, thank you for that. And school, now that, where did you attend school?
My father came with the missionaries from the coast Dubai to a place known as Ikuda at Kitui, about 60 miles from the district headquarters. Established a mission at Ikuda. From there, they moved to Mulango, where I was born, and established another station. This place is only about 2 kilometers from my home. And that is where I went to school. Because the missionaries did 3 things. Wherever they established a mission, they also established a school and a dispensary. These 3 things went hand in hand, and they attracted many people. So that is where I went to school, Mulango Primary School.
How was the life there at that time in Mulango and even at home or in Kenya? How was the situation?
Life was different from it is today. For one thing, there was nothing like early child education center. From school, we had all the time in the world to play. So we grew up as very free children, And at that time, parents were like Roman parents, very powerful. In other words, they kept their homes in order. A father could discipline a child to any extent. I was a very naughty boy myself. And I thank God because my parents were disciplinarians. And because of injecting in me that discipline, it transformed my life to appreciate discipline. And it enabled me to get to where I got today. So life was very free, really. We grew up as free children, but diseases were rampant. Many people died as young children because medication, hospital, in my district, there was only one hospital at the time. One. And the 2 dispensaries, Missionary. So you can imagine how difficult it was to get proper medication. So many people died.
What were some of the happy moments at that age that you remember playing? Which games were you playing? Do you remember?
Not organized games. We invented our games. We liked swimming because there was a river nearby. We liked dividing ourselves into teams and fighting each other with not stones, but there were things, round things like small balls, which we used. We formed ourselves into teams and we would fight each other. Then there were rolling games, and so on, all kinds of games. We were free, very free children. And that freedom was very useful, But whenever you cross the line, parents were very powerful in terms of disciplining children. And we were taught to respect not only our parents, but elders. And any elder could discipline you. If an elder found you mistreating another boy, you would be disciplined by him, and he would tell your parents, who would discipline you a second time, because discipline was highly regarded. Secondly, elders were very powerful. In our governance, each tribe had a council of elders, which were very powerful. And whenever there was a family dispute, it would be taken to the council for adjudication. For example, if you differed with your wife and you are beating her, or you wanted her to go to her home, council of elders will call the two of you to see whether they could adjudicate. In other words, we had our own governance. We did not rely on the British government to adjudicate everything. It's only very serious cases which were taken to the tribal courts as they were at that time. So discipline was very important, and it played a very important part in my formation.
You mentioned about...
Secondly, I went to a missionary school, and that missionary foundation was also extremely useful in my life.
Thank you for that. You mentioned about the mission school and the British rule. What was the attitude at that time from the Africans towards the missionaries? You said your father was shunned because of joining Christianity. What was the attitude at that time?
Actually, the missionaries were in many ways very different from the colonialists. As I grew up, my father was a church elder for as long as I can remember. He used to take me to the missionary homes. You know, for church councils, he would take me as a small boy, and I was very impressed with the cleanliness of the missionary homes. That sense of cleanliness was part of me. When I had my own home, I insisted on having a very high degree of cleanliness because of what I learned from the missionaries. In short, missionaries were very different from colonialists. Colonialists would shun you as an African, but missionaries were different. Certainly the ones who came to my area, we socialized with them. They would also come to our homes, you know, and eat whatever we ate. So they accepted the Africans.
I think it is important, like you mentioned, to differentiate between the missionaries and the colonialists.
Exactly. Exactly.
And they were different in the way they related to...
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
So once you went for your primary education there, or high school, did you go?
No, primary school, actually elementary school. During that time, there were elementary schools, primary schools, secondary schools, 3 categories. So for elementary school, I went to the missionary school. There was an exam, by the way, a competitive exam, which one had to pass in order to proceed with education. Because there were so few schools. So they were very highly competitive, you know. So I passed elementary school and went to Kitri Primary School. And believe it or not, in our district, an entire district, there was only one full primary school, not secondary, primary. Only one. And I managed to go there. We were only 4 of us who went to Kitri Primary School. And after primary school, there was a very competitive exam to select people who would go to high school. And you know how many high schools there were for Africans? By the way, there were European, Indian, Arab, and African schools. That was the system. And there were only 2 full high schools for Africans in Kenya. Alliance High School, Protestant, Mangu High School, Catholic. Only. For the whole of Kenya. And I went to Mangu myself. That's where I was accepted. And do you know how many people qualified to go to high school from my primary school? Only 4. From an entire district. That shows you how competitive the school was. But in all fairness, I must say that the quality of education was good. Why? Because after high school, one would get a very responsible job and do it well. Nowadays, I will comment on that later, but that's the way it was.
Yes, and you mentioned the 4 levels of schools. They were for the white, for the Indian, Arab, and for Africans.
Yes.
Was there a way they interlinked? Is there an African who could even dream of going to a white school or
No.
an Arab school?
No. They were purely based on race. And there was no question of an African going to an Arab school or an Arab going to a European school. No. They were highly segregated.
Did that raise questions for you at that age? Were people wondering why there's segregation?
No, we took it for granted. Before Kenyatta came to Kenya, or rather before Kenyatta returned from the United Kingdom, things were taken for granted. You know, we did not have, or there was very little aspiration for independence, really. It was Kenyatta who brought this dimension of, in full sense, African freedom. Not Kenyatta alone, as you know. There was a political party, others joined him, but he was, in all fairness, the main initiator